Did Games Workshop mismanage Warhammer Fantasy? That's the question for today. Now, this video is actually a follow-up from my video where I summarized a conversation that Peachy had on the painting phase. I'll leave a link to my video, which you can then click to find their video if you want. And after that video, a lot of people were saying, well, Games Workshop basically mismanaged Warhammer Fantasy, and that's why it died. So that's what we're going to address. Now, I think Peachy obviously wouldn't throw his colleagues and friends under the bus, so he wasn't really going to say anything negative that Games Workshop truly did. But I will. Now, in my eyes, it's obviously not just one mistake that they made. I think there's a few, and if you asked 5 different people, you'd get 5 different answers. There's no right answer to this. But one thing that kept coming up was the inaccessibility of Warhammer Fantasy and how expensive it was. Now, in Games Workshop's defense, when you consider Games Workshop's price per model and the fact that Fantasy you sort of by default need a lot of models, they were always fighting somewhat of a losing battle. However, I do think they could have helped the situation. One thing they could have done is make it so that the points per model actually went up rather than down, and they could have made a smaller army be the default rather than a bigger one. It felt to me towards the end of Fantasy that the points per model were going down, meaning you had more models of that type, and the battles were going up to either 2,500 points or even sometimes 3,000 points. And I feel like the opposite would have helped. If the points per model went up and you made 2,000 points the default, I think people would have felt a little bit happy about that in terms of the cost. In 8th edition, they introduced the Horde formation, and that seemed to be very intentionally a way of getting you to buy more models, more than you would have otherwise have bought before. Instead of needing a unit of maybe 20 or 25, you would now sometimes need like 30, sometimes even like 40 models in a unit. Now, both of these things, the points per model and the Horde army, probably made Games Workshop some money in the short term, but I think in the long term it was at the cost of new players and then those players actually spending money. I also think it made existing players less likely to buy more armies of a different type because they saw how expensive it would be. So in my opinion, Games Workshop deliberately made it so that more models were required, and while some people liked it, I think in the overall situation of the game, it hurt the game. But as I said, to some extent, in a game like Fantasy, it was always going to be a bit of a high buying cost. But something else that they possibly could have done is actually tried to introduce lower point battles as well. Yes, maybe keep 2,000 points as the default, as I'm like saying here, rather than 2,500, but they also could have made it so that the game was relatively balanced at maybe like 1,000 points, and fun as well as balanced, and we'll talk more about balance in a moment. And now we have seen Games Workshop sort of embrace this sort of like escalation style of pointing. Age of Sigmar and 40k, they'll say, hey, you can play at 1,000 points, 1,500 points on this sideboard and stuff like that. And I think, and I hope that the old world will adopt that, and I think Fantasy could have adopted that before they did it with the rest of the games. Having the smaller games actually be reasonably fun would have got more people to try it out, I think, but they didn't do it. On a slightly adjacent note, that's not really relevant to any of this conversation, I would like Warhammer Fantasy, the old world, be simplified a little bit, but I have heard that apparently that is not happening. We'll save that discussion for another day. Okay, let's talk about lore and IP. Peachy mentioned that there were IP issues with Fantasy because it was a bit more generic than, say, Age of Sigmar, and the team themselves felt maybe a little bit constrained by the lore and the universe. Well, the issue with that is Games Workshop had control over that to some extent. I'm not saying that if they made Orcs and Goblins Orcs in Warhammer Fantasy that the community would have loved that. If anything, I think that would have been a bad idea. But they could have introduced new things that they had the IP over and could control legally. They could have renamed Cathay into something else and made them more unique and specialized, like IP-wise. And lore-wise, they could have changed the way that dwarfs worked and made it so they could have the steam tank that they talk about. Basically, they limited it themselves. Sure, if you change the lore of the game, some people would have kicked off. That's inevitable. Some people love lore, and if you mess with it the way that they don't want you to mess with it, then they'll be unhappy. But if Games Workshop thought that was for the best of the health of the game, then you got to do what you got to do, GW. And this sort of leads on to Warhammer Fantasy not selling well because they had existing armies. Well, my response to that is that you make new armies that people actually want to buy. I mentioned Cathay before. They could have done it with Kislev. They could have like reworked them. Nippon they could have reworked. Araby they could have reworked. There could have been an island somewhere in the middle of nowhere that had a new race. You know, they could have done these things. And if you make like a new army and you make them super cool that people actually want, people will buy them. Not everybody, but you don't need everybody to buy it. You just need enough people to sustain the game, right? What Games Workshop were sort of trending towards instead of doing that though, was making it so that you had to buy another box for a unit you already had. They weren't making it very interesting. They were making it so that you felt forced to buy more models rather than actually wanting to buy more models. And these days I do think Games Workshop are way better at this, but I think they definitely squandered it with Fantasy. Now another thing that people might mention here that's not really like Games Workshop's fault, some people will say that the community was a little bit elitist. Even if it was, well, it's not GW's fault necessarily if it was. But secondly, I don't necessarily see Fantasy being more elitist than say a game like 40k or Age of Sigmar even. The percentage of people who are NLBs probably about the same. So I'm not going to blame GW though. However, I do think that people acted like Fantasy was a very competitive game. But let's be real, the game was very rarely balanced well. Some armies were very frequently much stronger than others. My favourites, the Dark Elves, at one point were very strong. Orcs and Goblins at other points have been very weak. And yes, if you are a really good player, you can probably win with the junk armies, right? I'm not saying there was no skill involved, but the balance was also quite often off. The fact remains that there was very frequently a flavour of the month, which in one sense you might think would help with sales. Maybe that was actually a Games Workshop tactic, that it helps with sales. And to be fair, it probably did a little bit. But again, that comes at the expense of your new players. They're not going to want to get into a game with a meta that's changing so frequently, where if they pick the wrong army and they spend hours and hours and hours building it and painting it, then they get beat, they're just not going to join in with that game. And your existing players who don't also want to do that, they'll be like, oh, I have an army already, I don't want to jump over to an army that's better just because I don't want to lose. So Games Workshop having this strong like flavour of the month probably hurt the game in the long run, but in the short term may have got them more sales. I think we can mostly agree that the balance of Fantasy was not amazing. I'd be surprised if many people disagree with that, but if you do let me know in the comments. One thing we have to talk about here, and I already mentioned it very briefly, is the price per model of Warhammer Fantasy and Games Workshop really. GW price per model is typically higher than their competitors and generally higher than historical war games and companies like Mantic. I would argue that GW still have like a really good quality and you sort of are paying for that to some extent, but it's undeniable that they are on the high side. However, this one doesn't really work as a reason why people don't play Fantasy, because that's the case with Warhammer 40k and Age of Sigmar, and people played those. The issue really is how many models you actually needed for Fantasy. So if the price per model is the same as other games and you need more models, then the game is more expensive. So yes, Games Workshop might charge more than other games and you can think that's good or bad or whatever, but the reality is it's the number of minis that you are required that is the problem, as I mentioned earlier. It also might be that because of Mantic and because the fact that you could use historical miniatures instead of like GWs, that maybe Fantasy uniquely had a lot more competition than its other games, and maybe that was hurting sales. And this basically meant, in a weird way, that Games Workshop outpriced themselves in their own game. And I actually think that that could be true. Maybe the genericness of Fantasy led to having more competition, and that competition with Games Workshop came out the loser. And that goes back to the IP and stuff like that. That I actually could believe. I think that may make sense. What's interesting on that topic with cost is with the dawn of 3D printing, I can't help but feel like Games Workshop bringing back the old world is coming back to a place where they may not sell as many minis as they think they might. 3D printing now is so accessible, and let's face it, when you're printing a lot of miniatures a lot cheaper, that I do worry about Games Workshop's opinion on the old world. Maybe they'll see it, think they're going to sell more than they are, and then once it fails, maybe they just can it again, and that would be absolutely devastating. However, we'll save this whole conversation for another day with 3D printing. So to boil it back down, did Games Workshop mismanage Warhammer Fantasy? In my opinion, to some extent, yes. I think they tried to make it so that you would need more models in a unit and just more models overall, and I think that backfired spectacularly. I think they gave themselves a constraint when it came to the IP and the lore that they really didn't need to. I think they could have rolled themselves out of it, basically. I think the game was poorly balanced, and I do think that would have hurt the game as well. I do think that the balance being bad may have been intentional, but maybe I've just got my like conspiracy theorist hat on there and maybe that's not true. And for me, those are the key areas that I think GW mismanaged Fantasy. Now, do I think they will get better at that? I'm not necessarily hopeful on some of those things. I think at this point Games Workshop are relying on nostalgia and just the fact that some players will not care about those issues going forward. Maybe they'll be a bit better at balance, but I'm not really relying on that. I'm not confident that they'll actually balance it any better, if I'm honest. But I can't see the number of minis coming down. I'd love it to be like 2k points and the points per mini to actually be higher, but again, I doubt that's going to happen. So we'll see what happens. Like, I'm not going to stress too much about it now. I do think that they could have done a better job with Fantasy. I'd be surprised if you find many people who think that they did a great job with it. Let's hope they do a great job with Warhammer the Old World. And I hope you had a most beautiful day. Sorry if this one was a bit rambly. I had a lot to say, but maybe it was difficult to say it, but you know, we'll see if we got there. Have a most beautiful day. Like and subscribe. Goodbye.